While working on these lectures about attitudes to diversity in medieval urban centers, I found it instructive to think about women as strangers to some essential areas of urban living, aliens to the plenitude of citizenship and authority. Women's work sustained whole industries, added that of other strangers, yet when it came to the disposition of public authority and civic deliberation, they did not take part, at least formally. This exclusion was underpinned by beliefs arising from contemporary science and religion, supported by law and custom, and naturalized in the public sphere in rituals and representations. It was possible to argue that women were deficient in reason and embarrassing, even dangerous, in body. That's just a little marginal decoration to a text by Agostino from the 14th century, the manuscripts from the 14th century. Historians have learned concupiscentia. Historians have learned over recent decades to understand that sexual difference is a necessary category for historical analysis. For sexual difference assisted the making of moral, political, and aesthetic distinctions. In the society we are studying, women in public authority were few, though notable. Yet women had authority within households. In some regions they could give testimony in courts and there to deliberate over issues that affected their lives, like dowry and testament. But their access to the rich array of cultural and social activities generated by cities was limited. And in that sense they were like a stranger in the city, with civic prospects less ample than those available, say, to a Fleming in London, a Tuscan in Venice, or even a Muslim or Jewish male convert in an Iberian city. The underlying logic of gender was so strong that it actually needed no formal elaboration in urban statutes. Everyone knew what the gendered order meant. In her exploration of it in The Book of the City of Women, written around 1405, court poet Christine de Pizan, the author, as it were, falls asleep in her study only to imagine with the help of ladies' reason, rectitude and justice, an ideal city. She turned to Lady Reason and asked, Most honourable and worthy lady, I'd like you to explain to me why women are allowed neither to present a case at a trial, nor bear witness, nor pass sentence. That was a question rarely raised outside the realms of poetry and rhetoric, though it may have been in homes and workshops. Women's lives varied somewhat across Europe. In Northern Europe, especially after the Black Death, many women entered service in mid to late teens and hence married later and had fewer children. In Italy, the age difference between spouses at marriage was considerable. Some 15 years on average has been estimated by Christiane Clapiche for bourgeois bourgeois couples of Tuscan cities, and so there were lots of widows and lots of remarriages around. Women were attracted to towns and cities where they worked in service and household workshops, or in the sale of food, drink, and those objects which working people could only purchase daily and in small quantities. Religious texts recognized women as virgo, uxor, vidua, virgin, maiden, wife, or widow, and provided sermons and materials directed at each of these types. Yet women's positions were more diverse than those categories suggest. Many women lived neither as wives nor as widows, but as single women, often in households headed by women. Cordelia Beatty has examined this category with care, the single woman, the woman not married. While sources on household size and shape are scarce before, say, 1350, when we do possess sufficient data, this shows all over Europe. Households where working women lived together, from York to Douai to Florence. And so there developed a difference in the ratio of men and women in urban settings too. In Northern Europe, women were usually more numerous, some 100 to 90 to 95 men. South of the Alps, it was largely the opposite, 110 men to 100 women, an area where women married younger and where slavery contributed in many cities like Genoa and Venice and Ragusa and Barcelona a significant portion of household labor. Maids were often immigrants. And so Le Ménagier de Paris, which is a sort of guidebook written in 1393 as it were by a Parisian older bourgeois to guide his young wife in her tasks, and to which we will return later, it is said, and know, this is guidance, how to hire maids, and know that usually such women from foreign parts are guilty of some vice in their country, and that is the cause that forced them to serve away from their place. So cities were full of working women, yet when contemporaries imagined these spaces, they conjured a quite different picture. Ambrogio Lorenzetti's fresco of the well-governed city, which we already saw 2 evenings ago, has women enjoying the good life. Women dance in a ring in the forefront of the public square. They ride out of town for the hunt. They are at peace and nowhere at public exertion. But just a decade earlier, in 1324, another great Sienese artist, Simone Martini, had depicted women in his altarpiece in honor of the local saint San Agostino Novello, who died in 1309. The holy man had been deeply involved in Sienese life and was buried in the Augustinian house there. Martini painted 4 images, I just brought them there so you can see them better, which took place 3 of them within domestic spaces and 1 that occurred on a rocky country road. Agostino developed a sort of particular protective power for children. The top left scene has him swooping down to stop a dog from tearing a child apart. At the bottom left, he arrives just in time to cradle a child and stop them from falling from a balcony. At the bottom right, Agostino arrives, superhero-like, to save a boy who had fallen out of a hammock onto a balcony. In both bottom left and bottom right, mother occupies the home. On the left, her hair is not properly, I'll just go back to that slide so you can see them all. Her hair isn't even properly covered or arranged as it would have been had she prepared to go out in public. The narrative presents the tender child as part of the sphere of a home. At the bottom right, mother ventures out in pious mode, dressed decorously, carrying her child as a votive offering after the miracle and offering him to the Church of Sant'Agostino. So women at dance, women at home with their children, women indoors. This is how male experts in representation chose to depict their cities to themselves. In reality, European cities had to live with the difference that was one woman on the streets, in public, with all the risks and temptations that women presented. As they did in other domains, lawmakers anticipated, legislated, and hoped to contain that risk, both to the individual citizen and to the city's reputation, its fama. For this reason, they legislated in control of women's property and dress and conduct. A woman's dowry, which followed her from her natal home and returned to her after her husband's death, was an important civic resource, an element of local wealth. We already saw yesterday, so the Statutes of Siena of 1309 obliged heirs and holders of a dead man's estate to satisfy a widow's claim of her dowry within 2 months of her plea. Many of those who worked and traded in the city, who owned property and the means to produce and exchange, were organized by craft and household. A glance at just one city's craft composition is really instructive, just to remind us what we're talking about. So in 1301, Edward I, King of England, issued civic ordinances for the city of York, his capital during the long, protracted Scottish wars, and it provided regulations craft by craft. The city had, at that time, 35 bakers, 26 taverners, 35 cooks, 49 butchers, 50 fishmongers, 70 brewers, 37 poulterers, 9 fish retailers, and 45 hostlers. These craft groups were led by men, but in them women, wives, daughters, and hired workers worked and bore responsibilities. In workshop households, women developed other work, like brewing, the ever-present brewing, and they helped sell whatever was being produced too. And in each household associated with these crafts, there were servants and apprentices to be trained and nourished. This household-based order and the workshops and businesses in which it was realized was affected by the very principle that enabled commerce, that is, the movement of people. Merchants were frequently away on business and for long periods, a reality of urban life that writers like Boccaccio and Chaucer so often exploited. So several towns legislated on bigamy, for example, like Verona in 1327. We decree that if someone who has a wife and she is alive contracts marriage with another woman, he will be punished by a fine of £100. Wives in merchant and artisan households were well versed in business affairs, often highly literate and numerate. Among the thousands of letters surviving from the correspondence of the Datini Company, based in Prato, some hundreds of letters were exchanged between Francesco and Margherita, and they've survived. They had married, so that's Margherita with her daughter Ginevra, and that's one of her letters to him there on the left. They had married in Avignon in 1376 when he was 41 and she was 20, as a very common age difference. One fortnight's absence, for example, produced 11 letters, discussions about health and travel plans, the quality of their wine, reference to a recent tiff they'd had, and plans for future purchases. Their writing style is plain, and the letters begin and end with common formulae, confident and commanding. Further down the social scale, but well provided for and highly active, was Lauretta Bonafazzi. I got to know through Dan Smale's wonderful treatment, this widow of Peire. We get to know her thanks to Dan and thanks to her accounts of 14034. Lauretta was in command of 2 systems of account, and she worked with different currencies in paying wages, diverse wages. She managed a large household of men and women, free and slaves, through the unceasing seasonal array of work and reward. Given the centrality of the households to production, training, and retail, what was to be done in the absence of a male head of household or at his death? In English, Flemish, and some German towns, widows could trade as femme sole or Kauffrau or Koopweef as an independent legal entity who could be taken to court for debt. That's absolutely crucial. You can't do business with someone who cannot then be taken to court in the case of default. And from the early 14th century, so could married women do in a lot of those regions, that is, be taken to court for debt. But even where this category did not exist in law, craftsmen realized that the most effective way of ensuring continuity in production within their crafts was to allow widows to run the workshops until a suitable heir, male heir that is, might replace her. So the shootmakers, the Bottai of Venice, added in 1338 to their statutes of 1271 the provision for the occasions of a craftsman's death. Item, if any master of this craft dies and leaves a son of less than 17 years, if the wife wishes to hold the craft for the son, she will act as master, in the position to work and instruct the youths in the craft until one of them is 17 and knows the craft to work as a master. Given their contribution, crafts involved women in some of their social activities too. The Venetian smiths provided in their statutes of 1301 for wives to be buried just like other male members of the craft, with the craft's cross and banner at their funerals. In Chester, at the very end of the 14th century, John the Almorer, an immigrant from the Isle of Man, was a successful merchant and member of the confraternity of St. Anne. So robust was his professional situation that after his death his widow, designated as a domina, as a lady, continued to run his businesses and enjoy membership of the craft. Guild regulations in 15th century Vienna similarly allowed widows to continue the workshop's activities. This period also saw women admitted to the freedom of towns as citizens where they had not done before. In 1388, Mabinia Taverner was received as Comburgensis of Kilkenny, and thus gained the freedom to buy and sell freely for the payment of 40 pence, as long as she lived in the suburb of Arstown. If she wanted to move to live in Kilkenny, she would then pay an additional 6 shillings 9 pence to the community. Women worked as servants and as labourers in workshops and at all stages of the preparation of textile. In England, this is visible in poll tax returns, and just to take literally one community out of the many that we know about, Salisbury in 1379, well, we have 55 women with textile designated names who paid their own contribution. In Exeter, studied so well by Marianne Kowaleski, women were particularly numerous as contracted workers in workshops of weavers and tailors. It is likely that after the Black Death, female apprentices became more common, if not an official category. In 1380-81, William Wimmock called his employee Joan Blackhay servant and apprentice. Similarly, when demand for working hands was really, really strong, other transgressions might be ignored. In 1450, the dean of the Spicers' Craft in Ghent allowed Beatrice, daughter of the spicer Peter de Wilde, access to the craft, despite the fact that her reputation might have been tarnished by the fact that she lived with Christoph van der Hove outside marriage. She in turn agreed to marry and hire Christoph as a compagnon, a laborer in her shop. Women with distinctive skills in the production of luxury, high cost and profit goods were rewarded with some additional freedoms. The survey of the occupations of Paris made for King Louis IX in 1286 by the official in charge of the capital, his prévôt, Étienne Boileau, shows just how crafts organized women's work. At least 9 crafts in Paris at the time employed a majority of women. I mean, literally almost all the employees were women. These were usually crafts handling silk for the making of really quite exquisite objects, little purse, little hair decorations, head decorations, veils, and so on. So there is a certain element of agency here because the women of those crafts, that group of crafts, they could select the person to represent them, but they were not actually represented. I mean, they did not themselves sit on the council of each one of these crafts. In another center of luxury manufacture, Venice, a category emerged in the later 14th century, mercantessa pubblica. These were widows usually registered with the arte di d'oro battiloro, that is, those who work in the very lucrative and specialized craft of making silver thread, gold thread out of beaten silver or beaten gold. And for this, Venice was famous. An interesting case of 1395, recently studied by Paula Clark, introduces us to the widow Lucia ab Auro, she's called, golden, of gold, who both sold gold leaf and made gold thread. She was supplied by a gold beater. Now, I simply have to share this with you. I was just looking at this a bit, and it still exists. It's a big deal in Venice. And still, it's sort of like a guy and all these other lovely women working there. I had to share that with you. She, too, was supplied by a gold beater, Alberto di Francesco, who extended it on credit as long as she worked solely for him. Lucia used a female slave, Benevenuta, who stayed on with her even after being freed, manumitted, and ultimately became a partner in the business. Lucia's widowed daughter, Franceschina, continued the business after Lucia's death and sold finished head jewelry to a mercer's wife for retail. Some well-situated married women also developed their own status of mercantessa, like the Venetian Pasqua Zantani, active in the 1360s, who traded silk with her husband and brother. But she also ran her own silver thread business. She supervised the men who beat the leaf, hired immigrant women workers to actually work the leaf, as well as foreign merchants, and worked also with foreign merchants. Here were networks of working women extended into kinship, with the hiring of nieces and nephews, whose marriages she also arranged in due course. In households of working women, strong relationships developed, which we can only ever glimpse, very, very rarely. One such relationship, I think, is suggested between the 2 women of Douai, who made a will together. So that's really quite interesting, I think. Know all those who are and will be that Jacques de France, but it's a Jacques, a female Jacques, de France and Liégards de Guesnang, as companions, make their will together. They left each other those goods accumulated during their life together. So there's a lot of words about togetherness and sharing. Since women did so much work, cared for young and old, supervised and trained rising craftsmen, and were entitled to a share of inheritance in the form of their dowry, there were occasions, many occasions, when they had to appear in court, deliver testimony, and take an oath. In the cities of southern France, this was accepted practice. Daniel Smale, again, has found several such trading women in Marseille, where some 24% of land transactions involved women. There were no, and I'm quoting him here, there were no impediments whatsoever, either legal or customary, on the testimony of women, and so they made up a very large percentage as well, over 20% of actual witnesses between 1323 and 1416. Such prominence in law arises in England from ecclesiastical courts very forcefully, where we have very rich sources, where women participated as effective witnesses and plaintiffs, with a distinctive style of narrating testimony and anchoring memory. And we have with us here Brona Kane this evening, whose book will come out this autumn exactly on this subject, studied with great insight and sensitivity. The participation of women as plaintiffs or witnesses diverged greatly across Europe, but many communities considered courts not to be really suitable places for women. In Ruthin, in northeast Wales, where women dominated the brewing of ale, and thus were often fined for transgressions against the assize, they were all presented in court by husbands. In Sassari, the statutes of 1316 made clear that 2 women witnesses should count together as 1 man witness. The statutes for the city of Buda of around 1403 make provision for women taking oaths, which say that if she's a married woman of good standing, she should swear in her own house. So the officials go to her house, so she doesn't have to go out and confront all the stress of the court, presumably. But if she is a fragnerin, a small trader, a peddler, then she should appear in the town hall, the court. Similarly, the 1439 statutes of Montebuono established that if a woman's testimony was necessary in a legal case, the vicar or notary should examine her outside of the commune's court, outside the palace or the city hall, outside, not clear where, but not in there. And wherever possible, she should be accompanied by a man, that same statute says. Involvement in trade also meant working with credit, and many women did just that, both wives working alongside their husbands and widows continuing a business. In 1338 in Bergamo, we meet Flora, widow of an immigrant to the city, making her will. She made the provision for relatives and left to the poor of her neighborhood much flour and vegetables and chickpeas, and she says, not hard, but nicely prepared in olive oil. All this was done in restitution for a lifetime's work as a lender of money in interest. Whilst most women probably did business in what Bill Jordan has called business of lending of the domestic market, there were some really substantial female moneylenders too. In 1275, we encountered Dreslina, a Jewish woman dealing independently, lending £100 to Nikolaus, the provost of the monastery of Klosterneuburg, not far from Vienna. And Hannah Mayer's exciting doctoral research on England shows that women lenders were more numerous and actually, on average, lent larger sums than their husbands, who were perhaps busy in other branches of business. Women also appeared in courts as expert witnesses in domains heavily populated by female practitioners. Sexual health was so closely associated with reproduction and childbirth that midwives were often called to give testimony in ecclesiastical courts over dissolution or unconsummated marriages. In cases where proof of majority was required, the evidence of a wet nurse who had actually nourished the applicant when he was younger was useful. And so the archives of Valencia, for example, offer cases aplenty of wet nurses, usually the wives of artisans, with details of the circumstances that had led to the contract of wet nursing and to the strong relationship between the carer and the nursling. Midwives were considered reliable witnesses to birth in other contexts too. When in 1358 the Trevisan Giacomo Roncinelli, now resident in Venice, decided to register his son's birth, he summoned a notary as well as the midwife who had just delivered the baby, Maddalena, another Trevisan immigrant. Alongside women made rich and influential in guild-related households, there were many more women involved in service or in the smallest type of retail. In his poem, which I've had the pleasure of being introduced to by Emma Dillon, who's right over here and has written so well about it, in the poem Le Dit des Rues de Paris of about 1280-1300, the poet Guillot describes the streetscape of the capital, which was then about 300,000 strong in population, and he walks through and describes routes across the river and in very great detail naming all the streets. So he really very often comes across women selling in the streets. This doesn't need much translation, it's mostly names. En la rue de Cécile, entraille tantos trouvailles sédiles. En la rue Renaud-Lefebvre, Mainte, où elle vente, et pois et fèves, selling peas and beans. There are lots of those sort of encounters. Oh, sorry. In the much smaller early 14th century Ruthene, the borough court recorded 56 women in their occupations. More than half, that is 33, were described as forestallers, vendors believed to be selling without a license outside the market. While women of all status in Ruthene turned to such retail, it was the really low status ones that were the repeat offenders, perhaps because they had fewer options. So they walked the streets and sold outside the market. In Ghent in 1402, the dean of the Fruit Sellers Guild stopped a woman who worked for a guild member, a bona fide guild member, from going to market, though she was allowed to help him carry the fruit, the produce, to it. She was living with him, so sexual dishonor combined here with her marginal status as a saleswoman. Access to the market was highly contentious as between different types of traders and offered occasions for bitterness and strife. The Ecclesiastical Court of Canterbury dealt in 1423 with a case of defamation in which Helena Somerset was summoned to answer for accusing Agnes, wife of Michael Norton of Oxford, of approaching the wheat market and with other legitimate traders sort of like, mingling amongst them and entering the market with them, pretending to have the right to trade and thus breaking the laws. This is a bad accusation, which of course the accused is countering. The sound of women was particularly unsettling to those who made city laws. Women were best not seen or heard in public, according to urban legislators, who even turned their attention to the participation of women in the age-old rituals of death. The early 13th century statutes of Mantua decreed that no woman can or should follow the body of the dead outside the house or go with it to its burial. The San Gimignano statutes of 1255 prohibited entry or exit of women from the gate of St. John when the dead is being carried to the church or to the grave to be buried, nor were they to raise the sound of mourning. Women's work was central to the town's well-being, but the shame they could bring on individuals and community was also very great. So urban statutes decreed penalties, and in some regions, rituals for punishment and shaming of those who transgressed the marital moral code. Most famous is the corrada, that rather extraordinary race through the city streets, of partners in adultery, which is depicted so really evocatively, I think, in that, again, famous set of illustrated statutes from Agen in the late 13th century that I return to so much in to illustrate these lectures. So the running in the streets, you see the sound, you see the trumpets, every form of humiliation, and often this is also combined with mutilation and even banishment following all that. And indeed, just to mention that disfigurement was a lifelong reminder of past transgressions for probably quite a few people in our cities, and could be incurred for relatively minor crimes, like in the town of Gourdon in the Quercy in 1324, a woman lost her ear, peria laurelia, for the theft of a chicken. In the later 14th century, greater surveillance of moral comportment is evident throughout European cities, and women received particular scrutiny, and I shall develop this theme of scrutiny in tomorrow, the last lecture. In 1403, the widow Freschetta of Manosque, who may have sold sex or just socialized with many men, was reproved by the city court because she had been inflamed by her passion, libido. She broke the code of honest widows and came together with virgins and married women, leading them by bad examples to acts of prostitution. Women knew their urban environment well, and some used it creatively to push against the prevailing expectations of what women should or should not do. Those who were eager to experience an enhanced religious life in their hometowns came to influence the shape of urban religion. While the first millennium of Christian life saw a search for religious perfection above all in rural or solitary settings, away from city life and its temptations, the period of urban growth also saw religious change. New religious orders engaged with cities and with the sins that they generated. Preaching to townspeople prompted the development of a style of preaching suited to merchants and bankers, to more literate lay people, the creation of an imaginary to fit the bustle, competition, and volatility of urban life. In the early 13th century, Francis of Assisi, of course, exemplified this perfectly in his rejection of the career path set out for him by his family to study law, to develop urban practice, marriage, and a civic life. While the friars attracted interested women, they struggled to accept them into their orders proper, offering what seemed in cities like highly conservative situations for them. And Franciscans and Dominicans really had arrangements for women that were like being basically Franciscan nuns or Dominican nuns. But ultimately, the Franciscans developed a compromise, a form of enhanced living in the cities, the third order, open to lay men and women, but associated with women above all. In northern European cities, in Flanders and Brabant, women who came to be known as Begijnen, seized more control, I think, of the shape of religious innovation. As Walter Simons has shown so well in large centres like Bruges and Louvain and Ghent, and many smaller centres too, groups of women, unmarried as well as widows, lived together supported by their labour and donation. When size allowed, they crafted sort of parish-like enclaves in cities, safe and self-sufficient. I'm just going to sort of delight you with some images for these places, which are gorgeous. Even today, retain that sort of interesting sense of both of being in the city and being closed from it. Women who understood well the rules of urban living there, they understood well, and so they managed to craft on the whole in these northern cities a form of living which did not very much threaten the gendered order. They did not preach, they did works of charity, they worked above all in textile, from combing to cutting, and sometimes in tailoring too. Women in these hundreds of béguinages managed their affairs with the array of writing skills required for such enterprise, and as Thérèse de Hemptine has shown, in some of the larger houses, they actually copied and illuminated books, and in some cases, like St. Elizabeth's of Ghent, even trained orphan girls in the craft. They became embedded in local life to the extent that when the Pope attempted to expunge such groups in the decrees of 1311, local bishops, as well as the Count of Flanders, resisted the decree and offered support to these inoffensive beacons of virtuous and modest feminine urban living. Women in Italian cities similarly carved out city space in search of goals in religion. We have with us Ella Kilgallen, somewhere here, who's doing a PhD, who's finishing a PhD about such women from the region of Umbria, women who turned parts of their parental homes literally into spaces for perfection. Often inspired by Franciscan preaching and pastoral care, such women rejected marriage and reassigned even modest domestic spaces into cells. Most spectacular of all was, of course, Siena's Caterina, the future Caterina of Siena, doctor of the church, a dyer's daughter who rose to European fame for her visions. Oh, I'm so sorry. There she is there, and that was her father's house, was now a sanctuary. Fame for her visions and suggestions of how to end the schism in the church. And the friars sometimes also attracted married women, like who were in marriage. In Valencia in 1443, it was remembered that years earlier, a father had to engage a wet nurse for his son, Johann Willem, since his mother, Na Leonarda, had renounced the world and took the habit of the friars, preachers, immediately after childbirth. Cityscapes were highly coded places, characterized not by utter separation between groups, but by what we might call zoning. All cities, and especially those with many visitors and newcomers, were full of signs and markings with church towers and shop and house signs. Townspeople lived amongst people similar to them by occupation, clerical status, ethnic origin, and religion, but not exclusively so. The urban map was made more complex for women, perhaps by the senses of danger and propriety in different parts of the city. Just how protected elite women were, wives of citizens of privileged foreigners, is made clear again in the Ménagier de Paris. That's the opening page, and that's just the way it's laid out in chapters, which again, just to remind you, was written in 1393. It teaches her not only how to cook for an assortment of possible situations and people of differing ranks, but also how to behave prudently in the city. The young woman would have to go out into the world to attend mass, to order provisions, and as she did so, she had to be accompanied by a maid and be well covered. Indeed, communal statutes protected such women by assigning higher fines to those who violated them. The statutes of Oragne of 1255 laid down a fine of 30 shillings Toulousain for knowing a woman carnally against her will. But if she was noble, of good extraction, and of good conduct, the fine would be determined by the court. Women were set apart, some for respect, others for disdain. One can imagine such a married woman exiting her home in the company of a servant and receiving the polite greeting of that flâneur, the poet Guillot, author of Le Dit des rues de Paris. Oh, it's messed up again. I'm so sorry. It was perfect at home in the hotel. Okay, so let's just read this together. I saw a woman on her threshold. She carried herself very nobly. I saluted her simply, and she me, by Saint Eloi. Eligius. There was an urban visual language then, a semiotic system which informed and guided every inhabitant. While the Church had a long history of regulating clerical garb, and with particular intensity in periods of reform, regulation of lay people's dress came later, and a lot of it came in urban statutes. By the later 13th century, sumptuary legislation became apparent in Occitan and Italian towns, restricting in particular the use of silks and furs in various combinations. In Montpellier in 1273, wearing silk was limited to women's innerwear. Let them not wear any clothes of silk, nor of gold or silver. They can wear silk in the lining of their clothes, but not externally. What began as control of waist and display developed into a system of hierarchical distinction, with particular fabrics and lengths and decorations assigned by status and gender to clerical and lay persons. So in late 13th century Siena, the waist and display were similarly controlled. The gown and overdress should not use more than 12 meters of scarlet cloth. In Speyer in 1356, women were forbidden from wearing men's coats, although these were presumably some really precious clothes which might be inherited and put to good use. Conversely, Jewish women had to wear the big loop earrings that Christian women could not, a sign of the Jewish woman's concupiscence. When a woman of Venice, indeed, in 1416, a Jewish woman went out without wearing her telling loop earrings, she was spotted and fined 10 ducats. However well-marked and covered women might have been, they were never utterly secure. Unwanted attention from strangers was a frequent experience in women's lives and emerges vividly from legal documents. Take, for example, the records of the small town of Gourdon in the Quercy that we've already met, where women were occasionally presented for theft, rarely for very grave crimes. The offenses usually took place in the course of interaction between neighbors. Women suffered the type of harassment which so often casts victim as perpetrator. So Bona, a Jewish woman of Gourdon, was summoned to be tried for throwing a stone at Père de Ferganel, a citizen's son. She answered for herself effectively in court that Père had thrown stones at her repeatedly. Bona was supported by 3 female witnesses, Christian witnesses. She was a Jew. First, Peyrona reported that she had seen Père, that's Gourdon. He threw a stone at the said Jewess once, and it did not hurt her. Then he did so again with a stone and hit her leg, and when he hit her, the said Jewess took a stone and threw it at the said Père. The witness Gagliarda, who followed, added that a great deal of chatter accompanied the exchange. Après gran rede paradas. Alas, we do not know how the trial ended. Living in a neighborhood offered support and safety, like these witnesses who come to court and speak for you, but it also pitted neighbors against each other with angry words and covetous glances at the possessions of those living next door. The 1316 Statutes of Sassari in Sardinia expected violence to erupt not only between men and women, but with women in the offensive, as in the clause de mulieribus percussentibus homines, a particular breach of authority. It dedicated a clause to woman-on-woman violence, especially that which left a mark on the victim's face. If any woman will hit another woman with a metal bar or a stone or a stick or any other thing and draw blood, if the strike was on the face so that a mark remained, she will be judged by the podestà. There was a sliding scale of substantial fines for free women and unfree for facial and lesser injuries. A case of Dijon, 1388, notes the marking caused by Perronnette, wife of Jacques Le Pitoul, who threw a handful of hot lime on the face of the wife of Suleiman the Jew and caused blisters dont elle a eu et a des ampolles, sort of like nasty blisters on the face. Violence between women, like that between men, was inspired by drinking and drinking places too, as the many instances of violence between Flemish women in the taverns of eastern England attest. And this is, again, I know this thanks to the wonderful work of Milan Pajic. Neighbors offered credible testimony in court, but also exchanged angry words. Around 1315, in Gourdon, Stephanos complained of the theft of an axe, a pan, a chest, some cloth, and a tripod. When he was asked whether he knew who did it, quis hoc fecerat, he said he believed that Guglielma Nadala had done it, a woman who, at his request, often came into the house and fetched water for him and tended to his home. When summoned, Guglielma said he had allowed her to take the items and that she had pawned them with the Jew of the town for 5 solidi of Cahors. Women accused each other of small thefts, like that of some flour, which the wife of Elias Boischel was accused of taking. In her defense, she said that the only reason she had entered the house at all is because she had heard the baby crying, the baby of that family crying, so she went in for good reasons. She should not be suspected of theft. Away from the neighborhood, being on the road, exposed all people to greater danger, and women above all. So travelers to and between cities tried to organize into groups and to pace themselves as between safe havens where shelter was available. Women, like Jews and priests, did not bear arms, and without obvious protectors were subjects to insult and abuse. That great traveler, Marjorie Kemp, described how exposed she felt when her companions left her on the road on her own. They left her because they found her really annoying. The night fell upon her, and she was right heavy, for she was alone, heavy meaning feeling low. She knew not with whom she might rest on that night, nor with whom she would go the next day. There came priests of that country, the Germans, to her where she was at hostel. They called her English sturt, which is apparently a really bad curse, and spoke many lewd words unto her. She had much dread for her chastity and was in great heaviness. Poor people were vulnerable. Women feared rape and dishonor, and women on the road were most vulnerable of all. The author of Sefer Hasidim, that early 13th century book of precepts for a good Jewish life, which were composed in Regensburg and which we've met already, opined that a woman traveler who, and this is a Jewish woman traveler who, hears she may be injured by Christians and fears they may sleep with her, can dress like a nun, so they may think she is a nun and not sleep with her. And if she hears that the enemies of Israel may hurt her, she can also dress as a nun and say she is Christian. So dressing like a nun is not the thing you do lightly. But if there are reasons to think, if there is evidence about a particular region or so, a Jewish woman could even do so. By the later 14th century, migration was often treated as a form of vagrancy. In the town of Manosque in these decades, all 32 cases of people recorded in courts as vagabonds were women, and their involvement in court cases had often to do with sexual offenses. Where ethnic difference combined with recent migration, we find women being suspects for prostitution too. Indeed, in early 14th century Ruthin, all those presented to the borough court for prostitution, every one had a Welsh name, a Welsh female name. Many Flemish women in 14th century English towns were presented to borough courts for prostitution and for keeping brothels. In Great Yarmouth, Flemish men were frequently fined for illegal sale of beer and keeping a bad hostel, mauvais hostel. And given that brewing and tavern work employed many Flemish women in England, a vicious circle of work and poverty and alcohol and sex emerges, often for women deemed foreign and even when settled and at work. The fine was often banishment from the town or city, and probably just outside to its suburbs. Urban ordinances and statutes regularly dealt with the presence of those considered common women. In areas which tolerated slavery, like the Iberian Peninsula, fueros repeatedly reminded locals not to encourage their slaves to offer themselves to sell sex. Systematic provisions became apparent in the 13th century in north and central Italy. In the urban statutes, prostitutes were treated as a nuisance. Religious houses like the College of San Salvatore in Bologna sought to distance such women from their compounds, or at least said they did, just as they sought to control the building of dovecots and drains, that is, in the same set of writings. In Siena, the 1309 statute explained that prostitutes should keep away from the street where the men who ran the city, the Nine, we already met them 2 nights ago, resided. And they had to keep 60 meters away from, or rather, any prostitute or ruffian or woman of bad fame should keep 60 meters away from the houses occupied by the Nine, the council of the city. Later in that century, the city introduced a yellow badge for the marking of prostitutes. We're still in Siena, as did Pisa too, a mark soon after used to mark the Jews. In London, prostitutes were expected to wear a striped hood, a hood of ray, according to ordinances of 1351 and 1382. Towns had red light zones, of course, like London's Cox Lane. The York Ordinances of 1301, which we already saw just a little while ago, were created by the king for the regulation of work in the city that was his capital for a while, craft by craft. The situation of the clause on prostitutes, I think, is very telling. After the rubric on hostlers and landlords comes the rubric on pigs and prostitutes. No one shall keep pigs which go in the streets by day or night, nor shall any prostitutes stay in the city. That's one sentence, there's just a comma in the middle. The drafter was thinking of about nuisance to the city, dirt in the city, noise in the city, and he began, if anyone finds a pig in the streets, he may kill it. And seamlessly on to, if any prostitute keeps a brothel and resides in the city, she is to be taken and imprisoned for a day and a night. And in order to encourage the enforcement of this, he added, the bailiff who takes her shall have the roof timbers and the door of the building in which she lodged. Nonetheless, he who rents out houses to prostitutes shall lose the rent of such a house for 1 term. Similarly, in 1331 in Bergamo, both prostitute and the person who housed her were targeted. That no public prostitute should stand or stay or live in the city or within the walls of the city of Bergamo or incur a fine at the vicar's discretion. And no one within the walls of the city should rent or give free to those prostitutes or to their people, to those associated with them, any house to be in and reside in or incur a fine of 100 imperial soldi for each and every infraction. Prostitution was a constant presence then in urban life, often located in areas associated with other nefarious activities like moneylending or placed at the edge of settlements. But the urban poet Guillot, our flaneur, saw women in Paris everywhere, on sale, wherever business was being done or anything interesting was taking place, like playing of music. He also noted that where there were students, there was always sex. Nearby, in the Rue des Écoles, we all know the Rue des Écoles in Paris, la demeure d'Anne Nicole. En cette rue, ce me semble, vont-on et fin et fuir ensemble. So there's both fun for sale, but also hay for sale in this area, which is quintessentially the space of the university. So by the 14th century, prostitution was at the heart of campaigns for the reform of civic life. When Emperor Charles IV had his capital, Prague, expanded to create the new town, which you see over there, the old wall was removed. So you see that there is that sort of the line where it says Greater Town, just under it there's a sort of line, which is the old town. And then he expands it to create the new town. So the wall of the old town is removed, and it means that the brothels that were on at the edge, that were close to the wall, are now bang in the center of the new town. I even put a red little dot there to make it more visible. As David Mengel's research has shown, the religious reform of the great preacher Jan Milic led to the transformation of the brothels, now in the center of the city, into centers of preaching and pastoral care. Care for prostitutes, usually by providing them with dowries and arranging marriage, was a branch of very active charitable work, which became more prominent as we progress in time over our period. And it's interesting, alongside calls for expulsion of prostitutes, we also see these initiatives happening side by side. Hand in hand with the harshening of attitudes came the creation of urban brothels in cities, whose supervision was farmed out to individuals, men as well as women. Venice did so with the opening of its Castelletto in 1360, in the Rialto, that hub of moneylending too. In 15th and 16th century Camerino, in the Macerata, women of ill fame were obliged to stay at least 20 houses apart from the Franciscan convent, other religious institutions, or any church, and this was to be checked by the local podesta and captain. Such women were truly outlawed. The statute goes on to say that anyone can offend them without punishment or fine. We note here the tone we've already reflected on and encountered in our discussions of medieval cities. Public discourse in many cities of the later 14th and 15th centuries included ambitious programs for moral reform to which townspeople in Italian cities and Iberian ones and throughout the empire responded. Those most exposed bore the brunt of anxiety and mistrust. The groups which lived in strangeness, prostitutes, beggars, Jews, troublesome hawkers of food, and the recently arrived gypsies, of course, of mid-15th century Europe, were marked, excluded from public spaces, and even banished. Most women, of course, couldn't be banished. Most women remained in place, in their troubling strangeness in the towns that needed them so much, and which in some ways actually cherished them. Unless they were dependents, of course, of those men destined always to remain strangers, the Jews of European cities. And to them we will turn tomorrow morning. Thank you.